Welcome, Ian Gordon, from all the way from Singapore, actually. Um, you,
Agree.
the National University of Singapore History Department, trained as a historian at the University of Rochester for your PhD, and one of the sort of preeminent scholars of comics. Welcome, Ian.
Hi, I'm Frederick. Thanks.
So, Ian, this is kind of crazy, right? You are Australian. You work. You're sort of head of the history department, National University of Singapore. You got your PhD at the University of Rochester, and you're like known as the comics guy. What's your origin story? How did you get to this place, and why do this work?
Well, there's short versions and long versions. The short version is that, well, no, I'll give you a slightly longer version. When I was a kid, I read comics and I read comic books in Australia, and they were reprints, mostly of DC comics. Um, and I was kind of, as a kid, I loved Batman more than Superman. And then I discovered Marvel comics, and those were great. I was very fortunate. We also had the English comics, comic weeklies, things like Beano and Dandy and Eagle. And I just found them interesting. And at various points, I outgrew them, or at least I thought I did. I remember I stopped reading comics, and then I with some housemates once when I was 20 or so, or maybe 19. They had all read comics, and we were talking about them, and we rushed out and bought a bundle of them. And then I read them again for a while, and then pretty much I kept reading them. Then when I was an undergraduate, I was looking for, in Australia, when I studied, you spent a year studying a single course. So I did history. After second year, you would spend third and fourth year just doing two courses. And then in your fourth year, you would write a 20,000 word honors thesis. And in my third year, I was looking for a topic, and I thought, Baby Huey. And where can I look at Baby Huey comics? And I happen to know Randy Scott already because I worked a few years in libraries before I went to university, dropped out of school. So I knew Randy by mail back in the days of snail mail. And so I corresponded with Randy, and I realized, because there was no internet, and he told me, yeah, we've got to run a Baby Huey here at Michigan State University in their special collection, their fabulous comics collection. There's two great state universities with comics, Ohio State and Michigan State. So I saved up all my money, and while I was a student, went during a vacation period, and went to Michigan State and realized, oh, I can't do Baby Huey. I don't know enough about American history and all the background of this. And my idea is a good idea, but I just can't approach the subject without a lot more knowledge. So anyway, then, what was I going to do? So I ended up doing an honors thesis on Australian, broadly speaking, comic art, political cartoons, comic strips, and some comic books and their importance in Australian culture. Then I went to the United States to do my PhD in American history, and like all graduate students, I scrambled every summer to, well, maybe not all graduate students, but I scrambled every summer to find some money to live on over the summer. And I got a 10-week fellowship at the Smithsonian Institution, which was just extraordinarily lucky. And I said I was going to do something on comic art, and I was meant to be at the National Museum of American Art, but the curator left, so I ended up at the National Museum of American History. And you could just sit down and do your own work and think through what it is you wanted to do. And so I sat down and I read Frederick Wertham's The Seduction of the Innocent, which I kind of glanced at before, but not read carefully. And he had a line in there about how comic strips weren't a problem. And I went, that's interesting. And around the same time, an art historian named Rebecca Surya was around in DC. She'd been at the Smithsonian, and she told me about the Swan Foundation for Caricature and Cartoon Dissertation Fellowship. And it was, this is quite a few years ago now, it was $10,000. And I was like, wow. Okay, so let me think of a topic and apply for that, because I was going to do a dissertation on New York intellectuals, but 4 books had come out and I didn't know any foundations that were going to potentially give me $10,000 to do a dissertation on that. So I got the Swan Foundation fellowship, which I remember shaking because I got a check for $10,000, which was the most money I'd ever seen at one time. And moved to DC from Rochester and spent 2 years working on my dissertation in the basement of the Library of Congress a lot of the time, looking at newspapers on microfiche film, because we didn't have, ProQuest databases or newspaper.com. So that's kind of how I got into it. And the result of that was my PhD, which became comic strips in consumer culture. So it's a sort of not quite completely by accident, but also a little bit by accident.
And in fact, kind of almost materially necessary, right? With that nice fellowship that you had, kind of leading you in this direction. So since then, of course, you've published numerous books on comics, comic books, comic strips, film and comics. Why does it matter?
Well, the comic strips in consumer culture is really a work of history, and it's trying to look at the way that changes in American society can be understood if you follow a particular form of art, if you like, or a commercial form of art through various incarnations. So comics, as we kind of think of them in America, they kind of come to prominence in a way in a lot of journals, but I focused on Puck, Life, and Judge, which were what I'd call illustrated humor journals. That is, they had a lot of cartoons. Some of those kind of looked a bit like comic strips, although often without word balloons, a lot of political cartoons, and a lot of written textual humor. And those led into what became humor supplements in larger New York papers like The World, and then later on Earth's Journal American. And then in those papers, eventually around the turn of the 20th century, you got what we would think of now as comic strips. But these all reflect changes in population, in education levels. People were able to read the comics because there was a high rate of literacy. And it also reflects a reorganization of society, the massive expansion of New York from about 1 million people in 1850 and I think only about 300,000 in 1830 to 3 million by 1900, the development of printing presses, the development of a national market where there are railroads that are connecting cities and taking newspapers from one city to another. So all of these, I argue in that first book, you can look at through the way that comic art developed into this highly commercial and very lucrative for the most prominent artists form, which is comic strips. So having done that, I was looking for sort of what other things can you do, and Comics and Ideology as a book, I'm the 3rd editor on that, and that's a project that Matthew P. McAllister at Penn State University initiated. And I joined in on that and contributed a piece on Superman, which once again is just a funny story. I was in Australia back in Australia from the US, and I was cooking dinner and had the TV on in the background, and Lois and Clark came on, and it was one of season one. I can't remember. It was a very early episode. And I was looking at it, and I was like, wait a minute, this is direct from a Superman comic book. So I then tried to write an article about that for the popular press, and it didn't get accepted. And then, as everybody, I needed a conference paper, and I dusted that off. And then Matt asked me to join this project, and so I dusted off that piece, and it became an essay. And that's where I started a chapter in that book. And that's where I started looking at Superman in broader ways than I've done earlier. Film and comic books, I mean, this is a behind the scenes of academia, why people do things. I got made the head of my department. This is my first tour of duty as head of department. And I realized, it's a very administrative heavy role, and I'm not going to get a lot of work done. So I decided, well, there hasn't been a book on film and comic books of any substance. And this is in 2004, 2005. And I thought, I think I can edit a book on this, but I'll need some help. So I went to my co-editors on that, and we put together a proposal, and we did that book, which there's some fabulous essays in that. No, there isn't an essay by me in that. Some fabulous essays and formal studies, very, very early pieces. There's one by Pascal Lefebvre, and one by Michael Cohen, who seems to have left academia on Dick Tracy, the Warren Beatty movie. So that just seemed like there needed to be a book, and this is before a lot of the big, more recent movies had come out. But of course, there's already Tim Burton's Batman and the sequels. There's the '78 Superman, and then already there was. I'm losing Ghost World had come out, and a couple of others like American Splendor. So a sort of a range of movies based on comics, graphic novels, whatever you want to call them. So that seemed like a book or a collection.
Yeah, very, very important book. And we're going to talk about your Schultz book in just a second. Ian, what is the Ian Gordon vision here? Trained as an historian, but more as a kind of American studies, say, historian. You've mentioned, of course, already the significance of comics, comic strips as a way to understand and enrich our understanding of history, culture, material culture, etc. But if you were to sum up your vision, your approach, your research program, what would that be?
Well, it's quite disparate because I've moved through almost every kind of form that comics have taken, at least in English-speaking cultures, and maybe not so much Western-speaking cultures. I don't work really on the Franco-Belgian comics, and I don't know that much about manga. So I've been interested in the political economy of comics, what that means, how that works. I've been interested in notions of ideology and the ways those find expressions in comics. Although that's always a very tricky thing because, of course, there's ideology in comics. There's ideology in everything. I've been interested, as somebody who's lived on 4 continents, I've been interested in what's common to comics, or where can we, what can we do if we look at them in a comparative fashion by looking at genre. And so I did work on that because I had some earlier background looking at an Australian kid comics strip, and of course I looked at the American strip Buster Brown, and I thought that there were some interesting comparisons that could be done there between Australian, American, English, and a French version of an American script. So a lot of it is really just driven, like I guess a lot of academics, really, by my own experiences, things that have interested me. Partially, a lot of it's about trying to explain America's influence in the world. And then out of that, some of it's been about trying to explain with Superman. I could never figure out why Superman was so popular. I'm not a huge Superman fan. As a kid, I was more of a Batman fan, but it just intrigued me. Why is Superman just so popular?
Mm-hmm.
How does that actually work?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why I wrote that book, because when I wrote that earlier essay, it changed my mind about certain aspects, and I dug around a bit more and thought through and watched far too many, like all the episodes of Lois and Clark, all the episodes of The Adventures of Superman, and all the episodes of Smallville.
That's a
Which,
lot.
you know, Somebody Save Me is ingrained in my head.
Yeah, let me.
So
Yeah, we're gonna talk about your Superman stuff in a second here, Ian. Right now, I mean, you're right. So can I just tell you, my confession is that I am totally with you. I do not get the Superman fascination. I am like you. I was a total Batman guy, and what is up with this Superman? And you do this really amazing study where you look at radio and newsprint and comics and TV. So yeah, dig in here for us.
okay, so this study started. I mean, you could say it started in my kitchen in Sydney in 1994 when I saw that episode. But it really was on the back burner for. I hadn't really thought of doing anything more until, again, when I became the head of my department back in 2005. I thought I need a bigger project that, you know, the film and comic books, that's fine. That's bringing something out that's going to engage me. But I need something that can be worked on now. And I employed a research assistant and got her to go and dig through enormous amounts of newspaper articles and all sorts of episode guides, and I accumulated an enormous amount of material. And then I started to read Superman comics, comic books in 2007, and I couldn't get to the heart of it for the longest time. And I would draft articles, and I would be unsatisfied with them, and then, you know, I published a few things out of the Superman project, and eventually I started to get the book in to take shape. And partially it was taking the earlier article on Superman at the end of the American century. I never remember my own titles, but, you know, ideology, myth, and nostalgia, and pulling that ideology, myth, and nostalgia out, and working on each of those aspects separately and expanding on them. And it changed my ideas a lot about that, about some of the you know, very finely grained academic analysis there, I guess. But I also started to be more interested in, I've been long interested in intellectual property issues. So the long-running Jerry Siegel and family case against DC produced an enormous amount of legal documents. And many of those were letters between DC and Jack Leibowitz and Jerry Siegel and Whitney Ellsworth. And these were a fabulous resource. And fortunately, a New York academic attorney named Jeff Trexler put PDFs of this online. So I was able to access these from Singapore, and so I accumulated massive amounts of these and went through these, and I was able to extract something of a timeline and a conversation between DC and Jerry Siegel. So I could write something about the production conditions of Superman, and what it meant for the authors and what authorship actually means when we all know Superman's probably most famous tagline is "Truth, Justice, and the American Way," which Jerry Siegel didn't write. It was written by Robert Maxwell for the radio. And then Olga Druce added on "and the American Way" after the Japanese attack Pearl Harbor. So when you get that sort of situation, there's something going on where we can't just ignore DC's role and just see them constantly as the bad guy who brutalized Siegel and Schuster. And Siegel and Schuster, incidentally, in today's money, in the 10 years between 38 and 1948, when Siegel and Schuster sued DC to get try and get their copyrights back, which they failed. But in that 10 years, they've made, I think, about $3 million each in today's dollars. So they weren't entirely exploited, entirely. I mean, I'm sure DC made a lot more money than they did, but it wasn't as though they sold their copyright for $130 and never saw anything else. They got 10%. Of the merchandising rights, and if I remember correctly, it's in the book. Look it up in the book. Don't listen to me on the exact figure. But they also got 50-50 split, if I remember rightly, on the newspaper comic strip, and that was very lucrative. So, I mean, I wouldn't say that they weren't exploited, but I don't think they were treated quite as badly as people often think that they were. So that aspect was something that I wanted to look at, and I also looked at fans by reading letters pages, and that was just an eye opener. I mean, that was probably the most enjoyable part of doing it. I really loved reading all those old fan letters from the late 50s through while they were published.
So if you were going to do the kind of elevator pitch version of why Superman is so wildly popular, or at least was, what would you distill this down to? Like, what is it about this mythos?
I would say, firstly, it's been incredibly, it may seem strange, DC understood what they had when they got it. When it started to prove popular, they knew they had something and they knew how to market it. And they went and did that. For them to do that, to their mind, they needed to control the intellectual property. So you have that, two things happening: that they own the intellectual property right to something that becomes incredibly popular, and they then go on to exploit that, which is a legal term. Lawyers use that all the time, to exploit that property for everything that they could. It also had, because it had so many incarnations, very quickly on the radio, comic strip within a year, on the radio within a couple of years, the Flesher animated cartoons, which folks can find on YouTube, because it had, and then those other incarnations made it widely available. And then World War II saw it become an incredibly popular comic book. The Army Special Services of the Army Library Service, I think. Anyway, the US Army distributed a special Army edition of the Superman comic book, which for years I read about it in a history of the Army Library Service, and I'd never been able to find it, but on the Grand Comic Book for issue 27, they have an alternate cover of the Army edition of the Superman comic book. So all of these combined to make Superman incredibly popular. And then DC was smart enough to put it on TV in the 50s. And then that just locked in a younger audience also. So smart marketing really, in many ways, has made Superman what he is. As such a popular figure, and fan engagement. You see in the letters pages how deeply engaged fans were with Superman. And it's not as though everybody actually loved it. I think a lot of people kind of found it goofy and they liked it. I having read a lot of these earlier ones, or gone back and read some of the crazy 1950s, 1960s ones, I really like those because they're so off the wall. They're insane. And as a kid, of course, Marvel was so much cooler. But to go back and look at these DC ones, it's like they were trying anything and everything. And I can't but help think that having read those, just the way it must have opened up people's minds to what was possible in a story, that you could really tell a story about anything. In any way, shape, or form. So that's part of the appeal. I mean, that's not an elevator pitch, which is probably why I'm a historian.
No, that's really insightful. Thank you, Ian. You continue to do work in, at least on the superhero, and in this co-edited volume with Liam and Angela, you really interrogate or put some pressure on the symbol itself. What about the symbol? And then my follow-up question is, gosh, I mean, yeah, there's some not so good superhero movies. Marvel, DC, big two reconstructions and the big silver screen, but there's also some pretty good ones. So yeah, let's start with what about that symbol, and then, do we really have to kind of talk about Marvel Cinematic Universe or superhero movies as not cinema?
Well, this volume is part of an Australian Research Council major grant, about in excess of $300,000, which there's a follow-up volume in the works at the moment. We looked at, we shaped it around the symbol because we were looking at, as the cover shows, the ways that superheroes are often evoked, either very directly or indirectly, in social movements. And of course, around Comicsgate and around various aspects, people accusing folks who want to use superheroes in social justice movements as somehow introducing politics to comics, which is always highly amusing given that Captain America punched Hitler in the face, and that Superman's very early episodes, his first episode, he's trying to stop a person being wrongly executed due to failings in the court system. So superheroes have always been involved in social justice. That's the whole notion of superheroes. So we were looking at those. We were looking at very broadly at symbols, including things like intellectual property. And there's a fabulous chapter in the book on She-Hulk as an intellectual property lawyer, which is one of my favorite chapters. And then but it's not just intellectual property. It's the other symbolic functions of superheroes, and these are quite wide and varied in the ways that they've been used. So the book really covers a gamut of those, and I wish, of course, being at home, that's the one book that I don't have at home with me as a physical hard copy to quickly have a look through again. But it really it deals with things like Irish representation, which works in Australia, but it's Irish. Has a wonderful chapter on that. It also is pretty good because it's got interviews with Paul Dini and other figures as well, industry players. And it came out of a conference in Melbourne that had Hope Larson and Paul Dini as public speakers, and Henry Jenkins was also meant to be there, but he had unfortunately wasn't able to come, but did his talk by Skype, the wonders of technology. So it was a big public-facing event that produced this book.
Well, speaking of Henry Jenkins, then, so how do you answer this this Scorsese comment?
I like Scorsese movies. I mean, just in general, I like movies that are more plot narrative driven than and character driven, close, tight studies. But it's a bit sniffy to just say, well, he said they're not cinema. So perhaps he has, we use film, movies, and cinema sometimes interchangeably, but perhaps he has in mind cinema is a certain kind of category of what we might at other times call movies or films. Look, Graham Greene, the English novelist who's the late English novelist, he has about 30, 40 novels, and he divided his novels into two kind of categories: entertainments and serious literature. Now, I, for one, have read a lot of Graham Greene, and I'm not quite sure what the difference is, but maybe I'm just not a careful enough reader. But I would say that Marvel movies are entertainments. And then the sort of things where you go in and, you're not really going there to have your mind expanded in various ways or to be overly troubled. They're escapist fare, and they're with occasionally serious themes. But by and large, you're going in there for a dose of hope that everything's going to be all right in the end, like half the world can die, and plot spoiler, it works out okay, more or less. Some people still have to die, but not half the world. So we're not going to see Marvel movies for deep significance. We're going to see them for some diversion from, some of the day-to-day, woes of being humans, which are just part of being humans, indeed. But a bit of diversion is not a bad thing. Now, if they're sucking all the dollars out of the movie industry, and so movies that challenge us aren't getting made, yeah, then on that, yes, that is a problem. But that happens in Hollywood all the time. After the independent filmmakers like Francis Ford Coppola produced a lot of great movies, suddenly all Hollywood wanted was those kind of movies. They didn't want musicals, they didn't want other genres. So I think we're just in that superhero movie moment, and I suspect that will pass. And we'll still have some, but they won't suck all the dollars available for making movies. Hopefully they won't take them up, but they'll take them up enough to give us some nice escapist fare from time to time.
Jumping kind of back a little bit to your passion, your early passion that kind of launched your career. Peanuts. I mean, this is a beloved strip, and so much a part. I mean, if we're talking about Superman as a kind of pervasive mythos, well, Peanuts is easily that as well. Why study Peanuts?
I learned so much as a co-editor of this book, and I came to the project a little late, but I read all the chapters. I can't say that any of them really that I can recall needed a lot of input, a little bit here and there, but it is a really it's a really strong book, and it takes different aspects of Charlie Brown. So it opens with a piece by Ben Saunders on Peppermint Patty, and that is just a fantastic analysis of of both the complexity of Peppermint Patty and also Schultz's common decency. And I think one of the things that runs through Peanuts that makes it so strong is that Charles Schulz was just a decent human being, and the strip is about what it means to be a human being and some of the problems of that. So from that, you can open up all sorts of angles to study the strip. And there's some wonderful ones. And just, I was flicking through it today, and Leonie Brearley has this wonderful chapter on sincerity in Peanuts. And she concludes by saying Charles Schulz understood this, which is the complexity of humans, the difficulty of being a human being. He understood that, and he articulates with soft, gentle clarity that sincerity is important, mysterious, and difficult. Truly, how can he lose when he's so sincere? So it's sort of like she focuses a bit on the way that plot spoiler, Lucy always pulls the football away from Charlie Brown when he's trying to kick it, and how Charlie Brown is such a sincere person that he's always drawn into that. How Schultz presents this is the strip as a whole is its humor works kind of the irony of human behavior, our capacity to want to believe in things, for instance. Mm-hmm. So I honestly, secretly, I think my chapter is one of the weaker chapters in the book, although one person really loved it, because I write about Charlie Brown's reception or Peanuts' reception in Asia. But most of the other chapters are engaging with Peanuts through various themes that you will find in it, like sports or Snoopy as the mascot for the Apollo missions. That you have just its place in American culture and indeed around the world is just kind of staggering. And I think it all boils down to just the way that very gently Schultz understood humans, poked a little bit of fun at a little bit of gentle fun at us all, but in such a loving manner that people can read into it all sorts of things. And yet at the same time, Schultz put things in there that it's hard not to come away understanding that, yeah, that Peppermint Patty, she's queer, probably. So yeah, I think hats off to him. He this aspect, his African American character could have been better, but that said, at least his was a whole lot better than when Hank Ketchum and Dennis the Menace tried to do it. So
yeah, a very special place in all of our sort of hearts. You are a man of the archives. This is you here, I believe, with us at OSU. Is that right? Yeah, it looks.
That's in the Billy Island, and up front that's Eddie Campbell, and then that's Christina Meyer from Germany, and then that's me in the back, which is great.
Yep. I for some reason, the way the desks are, I didn't recognize it at first, but yeah, yep.
Which is good that I'm way in the back because I've lost a bit of road
so
you can't see how heavy I was.
You teach, you had a big MOOC that was really popular that you have transformed into an online course for your university. You of course are a beloved teacher of comics. So what is the, say, trademark Ian Gordon classroom comic moment or technique or something? Yeah.
Well, you know, a lot of folks teach comics. I don't so much teach comics. My course is called Superhero Entertainments, and it's a sort of a history of the political economy of superheroes. So I do start with comic strips because I want to latch on to one of the things that made comic strips so commercially popular was these distinctive characters from the Yellow Kid to Buster Brown and then onwards through, you know, Charlie Brown and so on and so on. So, and that these distinctive characters were marketable outside of comics in other forms, be it in dolls or with Buster Brown. For years and years, there were Buster Brown shoes and Buster Brown textiles. You know, there's even Buster Brown milk. So this sort of marketability of distinctive characters was important. When superheroes came along with Superman, DC understood the importance of marketing these characters. And that now we have a word for it, it's called transmedia now. But this kind of approach to marketing meant, as I said earlier, that Superman very early had a lot of other media incarnations. So that's what I'm looking at. I'm looking at the way that there's an interrelationship between comic characters as commodities, and then their sort of broader symbolic worth as icons or as beloved figures, whatever symbols, whatever term you want to kind of hold on to for the way we interact with these and perhaps use them as reference points for moral judgments and various other aspects of the way we live. So I tend to look at our superheroes. You know, the two questions I set in my course have long been are superheroes a modern mythology? And the other question is, you know, is the status of superheroes as commodities their most important function? Mm. And there's no answer to that. There's no right or wrong answer to those. I get wonderful responses from students. Of course, I get some not so wonderful, but I get arguments on both sides that, you know, superheroes are modern mythology, and I get all sorts of answers there that range from they play a social function that gives them a status as mythology to they simply reflect you know, they're modern versions of Hercules and Mercury and so on. And then I get answers about whether they're commodities on both sides. Some say, well, you know, it's their iconic or symbolic status that drives their value as a commodity, and other people say it's their status, you know, the values that we attribute to them and our engagement with them that make them important as commodities. Mm-hmm. And honestly, I've become one of these wishy-washy academics that go, oh yeah, oh that's right. Oh wait a minute. So I'm no longer quite sure what I think. So, yeah. But that's a good thing to let students kind of explore this question, to not have a firm answer in mind, to look for the quality of kind of arguments they can bring to it.
Yeah, wonderful. So where do you see the vitality in comics and comics studies today, Ian?
I think it's in the young. There's a younger group of scholars who recently finished their PhDs, or maybe not so recently. One to Ohio State University to plug. I need to hold that in front of myself. You can see my apartment doesn't look out over the fabulous downtown Singapore. This is a great book on the Yellow Kid by Christina Meyer that she was researching in that photo. And it's just fabulous. And of course, it's from Ohio State University Press, so they'll be very happy with me plugging it. And she is one of the, you know, younger scholars who's out there doing fabulous work. Another one, as I'm going to plug books, I'm sitting here, have near me is Paul Williams' wonderful book on the sort of the origins of graphic novels, dreaming the graphic novel, how comics artists and writers who have long wanted to do work that really pushed them and let them deal with more complex subjects, brought the graphic novel into being. That's a fabulous book. And then there's this whole Palgrave series, and this is just one by Marky Numan and Benoit Prufix on comics and memory. But there's some fabulous work coming out in that. It's too expensive. Go and look for it in the library and just bring a link. But that Palgrave series has some great work. There's so many, when I started doing work on comics, I was a historian, and I said, I'm a historian, because there wasn't comic scholarship. And as comic scholarship developed, it was always a majority of guys. And these days, that's just shifted so much. And when you go to these academic conferences on comics, the majority are women. And that's brought a vitality to it. I could start naming names. I should probably mention Leah Mesmer, whose work I really enjoy, particularly the work on fans and the ways that she's fought through this correspondence zones. But there are just so many others. Once I start naming names, I'm going to leave people out, which I don't want to do.
What about comics themselves? What are you reading? What's exciting to you right now?
I'm looking at what I actually brought home. I hurriedly, before we had to leave our offices, I finally bought a copy of Astraeus Polo, and it arrived. And unfortunately, in my haste, I bought a Spanish copy. So I'm going to have to work on my Spanish, or perhaps if I ever get to travel again, I'll bring it and give it to you. What else am I reading at the moment, comics-wise? I've got Guts sitting here, and I've got, I love work by the cousins, the Tamaki. So I've got Harley Quinn by Mariko Tamaki sitting here, and I'm looking forward to her work that she's doing. Is it Wonder Woman? Do I have that right? I think I read somewhere. And of course, I've got Guts, which after I read it, I'm giving to my younger nieces and nephews. So I think, yeah, these are the things that I've been reading more lately. I don't like a lot of current superhero comics, but I have to be more selective about those. And I tend not to read comics these days, except for academic purposes, which tends to be a lot.
Well, we have a finite number of hours in the day, and completely understandable. So, gosh, Ian, thank you for joining me from Singapore. Clearly, comics matter. Thank you, Ian.
It's been a pleasure.